May 17th, 1974. Dublin, Friday evening rush hour. On Parnell Street in the north inner city, shoppers are finishing their errands and workers are heading for the bus stops. At exactly 5:28 in the afternoon, a car bomb hidden in a stolen vehicle detonates without warning. The blast tears through the street at peak pedestrian density. 2 minutes later, a second device goes off on Talbot Street, one of Dublin's busiest commercial corridors, 400 metres from the O'Connell Street bus routes. Shoppers, commuters, families, all caught at the worst possible moment on the worst possible street. Within 2 more minutes, before any alarm has spread, before anyone on Talbot Street has even processed what just happened on Parnell Street, a third car bomb detonates on South Leinster Street, within earshot of Dáil Éireann, the Irish Parliament. 3 bombs, 3 streets, less than 4 minutes. No warning given for any of them. 90 minutes later, a fourth car bomb explodes outside Greason's pub on North Road in Monaghan town, 130 kilometres to the northwest. The death toll, 33 people, 26 in Dublin and 7 in Monaghan. Close to 300 more are injured. Among the dead on Parnell Street are people who were waiting at bus stops. In Monaghan, Marie Butler, 21, from County Offaly, Anne Byrne, 35, from Dublin, Thomas Campbell, 52, from County Monaghan, Simone Chetrit, 30, from France, Thomas Crawkin, 36. 33 individual human beings going about their Friday evening who didn't come home. It was the deadliest single day of the entire 30-year Troubles. More people died on those 2 Dublin streets and in that Monaghan town square than in any other single atrocity the conflict would produce. More than Omagh in 1998, which killed 29. More than Bloody Friday in 1972. The worst day, by any measure. The Ulster Volunteer Force, a loyalist paramilitary organisation based in Northern Ireland, claimed sole responsibility in a public statement issued in July 1993, 19 years after the attack. The British government has denied state involvement at every point since, and the files that might settle the question, the intelligence records, the security assessments, the operational documents, are still sealed, still locked away. 50 years later, the families of the 33 people killed that Friday are still waiting. That is the story. Not just what happened on May 17, 1974, but what didn't happen afterward. No prosecutions, no meaningful cooperation from the one government whose files matter most, and a question that official investigations have circled for decades without ever being given the tools to answer. How, exactly, did the UVF do this? Start with the bombs themselves. 4 car bombs, planted in 4 stolen vehicles, driven from Northern Ireland across the border into the Republic and positioned at rush-hour choke points in 2 cities. Every device functioned exactly as intended. Not one failed. Not one misfired. Not one vehicle was stopped at any checkpoint during a cross-border operation involving multiple teams and 4 separate explosive payloads. The explosive material was almost certainly commercial gelignite, the standard material for loyalist bombs of this era, stolen from quarries, building sites and construction projects across Northern Ireland and Scotland. UVF sources and historical accounts from the period consistently describe gelignite as the primary material. There is no confirmed forensic evidence of military plastic explosives, and the suggestion that the Dublin and Monaghan bombs used Semtex or equivalent military-grade material goes beyond what the surviving record supports. So the forensic argument isn't about exotic chemistry. It never was. The original Garda forensic files that would normally document explosive composition and timing mechanism design from the 1974 investigation are, in any case, unavailable, missing from the files when later investigators went looking for them. The McEntee Commission, established after the Barron inquiry to continue certain examinations, reported that huge amounts of relevant documentation have gone missing from the Garda files, and that it's impossible to determine whether further documentation may also be missing. The forensic record of the worst bombing in Irish history is simply gone. What the forensic argument is really about, properly framed, is operational coordination. 3 bombs going off within 4 minutes of each other on 3 different streets requires reliable timing devices across multiple vehicles staged in different locations by different personnel. The bombers had to move explosive-laden cars from Northern Ireland, position them in busy commercial areas of a capital city, set timers with enough precision that all 3 detonate within a 4-minute window, and clear the area, all without a single failure, without a single premature detonation, and without being stopped at any checkpoint during a journey from one jurisdiction into another. The Monaghan device adds a further layer, a 4th vehicle, a 2nd city, a separate team operating 130 kilometres from Dublin, detonating 90 minutes after the first Dublin bomb. That gap strongly suggests 2 distinct operational units working in coordination from a shared plan, communicating across distance during an era without mobile phones. The cross-border logistics alone, moving 4 stolen vehicles loaded with explosives through RUC and Garda checkpoints, required either exceptional luck or some form of prior intelligence about patrol patterns and checkpoint rosters along the relevant routes. Before measuring what the UVF achieved on May 17th, we need to be precise about what they had been doing before it. The UVF wasn't a naive organisation encountering car bombs for the first time in 1974. On December 1, 1972, 2 car bombs exploded in central Dublin during a live Dáil debate on anti-terrorism legislation, killing 2 bus conductors and injuring 127 people, a cross-border operation that occurred 18 months before the May 17th attack. During 1970, the UVF carried out an estimated 27 bomb attacks in Northern Ireland and 4 further bombings in the Republic of Ireland. By the late summer and autumn of 1973, the UVF's campaign in Northern Ireland was so sustained and intensive that the organisation was reportedly detonating more explosives per week than the IRA and UDA combined. And by the time a temporary ceasefire was called in November 1973, the UVF had been responsible for over 200 explosions that year alone. A former UVF explosives officer, interviewed years later by a journalist writing about the organisation, described the 1973 period in graphic terms. The terrifying hazard of working with unstable materials in improvised conditions. The black humour that developed among men who knew a mistake could kill them faster than any enemy. He spoke vividly of bleaching his own hair white during an experimental explosive mixture test. The UVF learned through practice, sometimes at catastrophic cost. On November 18, 1973, a UVF member named Charles Logan was killed by a premature bomb explosion at a farmhouse in Desert Martin, County Londonderry. He wasn't the only person hurt by their own devices during this period. A 2025 peer-reviewed paper published in the journal Terrorism and Political Violence, which included research interviews with former UVF combatants, concluded that loyalist paramilitaries were capable of carrying out these attacks. That conclusion is supported by the historical record. Journalist Ed Maloney, writing about UVF tactics in this period, described no-warning pub bombings as the organisation's forte. Members were trained in bomb-making. The organisation had developed homemade explosives and had the logistics to move materials across the border. But capability isn't the same as execution, and the gap between what the UVF had done before and what happened on May 17th is operationally significant. Their previous cross-border attacks were notable for audacity, but not for precision. The December 1972 Dublin bombs killed 2 people, far fewer than a peak-hour strike on the same streets might have achieved if the timing had been more deliberately calibrated. The UVF's intensive 1973 campaign, while impressive in volume, targeted specific premises, individual pubs, businesses, offices, rather than coordinated multi-vehicle operations across 2 separate cities. The organisation's bombing campaign largely collapsed after 1977 due to a lack of explosives and bomb makers, per the UVF's own history. What happened on May 17th was categorically different in scale and precision. 4 vehicles, 2 jurisdictions, 0 device failures. The key investigative question: who sourced the explosives and coordinated the timing, and who provided whatever intelligence enabled the cross-border movement of 4 vehicles to proceed without interception, has never been formally answered. Part of the reason it has never been answered is that the people who might answer it have consistently chosen not to. The Barron Report, published December 10, 2003, is the most significant official examination of these events. Justice Henry Barron, a retired Irish Supreme Court judge appointed by the Irish government to chair the Independent Commission of Inquiry into the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, spent years gathering evidence before producing a report that was careful, measured and, within its limits, damning. Barron found that the attacks were carried out by the UVF, primarily from its Mid-Ulster Brigade and Belfast Brigade units. He found it likely that British military personnel helped the UVF carry out the bombings, including personnel associated with what became known as the Glenanne Gang. His report recorded serious concerns about possible collusion between elements of the British security forces and loyalist paramilitaries. The Irish Times, summarising Barron's conclusions in December 2003, noted the report's finding that within a short time of the bombings taking place, the security forces in Northern Ireland had good intelligence to identify those responsible. Good intelligence, rapidly obtained, never acted upon, never shared with Irish investigators. Barron also found that the Garda investigation had been inadequate and that it stopped prematurely. He was unable to determine why, because the documentation that might explain the decision had itself disappeared. He didn't name specific MI5 officers. He didn't find conclusive proof that the British state, as an institution, ordered or directed the attacks. But what he documented in precise judicial language was a pattern of operational connection between UVF units in this period and individuals who simultaneously held positions within the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the Ulster Defence Regiment, and British Army intelligence. His report also assessed the evidence of Fred Holroyd, a former British Army captain who served in Northern Ireland with military intelligence in the mid-1970s, and who gave evidence to the inquiry. Holroyd stated that the bombings were part of a pattern of collusion between elements of the security forces in Northern Ireland and loyalist paramilitaries. Barron's assessment of Holroyd was notably nuanced. He described Holroyd as a complex source, noting that some of his specific details were unreliable, while his account related to events which did happen. More strikingly, Barron found that RUC officers who were questioned about Holroyd had, in their eagerness to discredit him, made inaccurate and misleading statements which tarnished their own credibility. The official denialists were themselves caught being dishonest. Holroyd, for all his complexity as a source, was proven correct in at least one specific allegation the RUC initially denied: that a Garda officer had arranged a meeting in Dublin between an Irish Army bomb disposal officer and his British counterpart. The Glenanne gang sits at the centre of the collusion pattern Barron documented. Named after a farm in County Armagh, the gang was a loose but consistently deadly alliance of UVF paramilitaries and serving or former security force personnel, RUC officers, UDR soldiers, British Army intelligence operatives, operating together on sectarian murder campaigns throughout the 1970s. The Pat Finucane Centre, which spent years mapping the gang's operations, has linked the network to over 100 killings. Multiple investigators and journalists have placed Glenanne network personnel at the planning or execution of the May 17th operation. Billy Hannah is the figure who makes that connection most concrete. Hannah founded the UVF's Mid-Ulster Brigade in Lurgan in 1972 and led it until his death in July 1975. He simultaneously held the rank of captain in the Ulster Defence Regiment, a locally recruited regiment of the British Army. A man commanding a loyalist paramilitary unit while holding a British Army commission and, according to one book source drawing on UDR, declassified research, led the UVF's bombing attacks on Dublin in 1974. The UVF's own organisational history records that Hannah and the brigade's subsequent leader Robin Jackson, known as the Jackal, were both implicated by journalist Joe Tiernan and by former RUC Special Patrol Group officer John Weir, as having led one of the units that bombed Dublin on May 17th. John Weir matters here. A former RUC officer who later became a source for journalists and official inquiries alike, Weir alleged that Glenanne gang personnel participated in planning and executing the May 17th attack. Barron accepted parts of Weir's account, but was careful not to treat it as conclusive proof of every detail. The significance of Weir's testimony is less about any single claim than about what he represents. A serving RUC officer with specific knowledge of what a network involving other RUC members was doing, and willing to say so. The wider Glenanne gang record reinforces the picture. The gang was responsible for some of the worst sectarian murders of the Troubles. The Miami Show Band massacre in July 1975, which killed 3 members of a popular Irish dance band at a fake British Army checkpoint, was carried out by UVF members, including 2 who were simultaneously serving in the UDR. The overlap between the UVF and the British Army's own locally recruited regiment wasn't a rumour. It was documented in court. Operation Denton, the PSNI commissioned review, led by John Butcher and examining 127 killings linked to the Glenanne gang, reached a broad conclusion at the 50th anniversary commemoration in May 2024. Butcher stated publicly that there was collusion between elements of the security forces and loyalist paramilitaries in the gang's activities overall. He wasn't hedging. He was describing a documented pattern of cooperation across the gang's entire operational history. The intelligence picture makes the collusion argument harder to dismiss as mere speculation. British Army and RUC intelligence about loyalist suspects responsible for cross-border bombings in 1972 and 1973 was never passed to An Garda Síochána. Irish investigators were working blind, while British security services held files that identified suspects and documented operational patterns pointing clearly at the networks responsible. That gap was confirmed when later archival research opened active Garda inquiry lines that investigators had not previously known about, more than 4 decades after the events. The British Army and RUC had gathered intelligence on who was bombing Irish civilians across the border. They had identified suspects. They chose not to share that information with Irish investigators. Not in 1972, not in 1973, not after May 17, 1974. Colin Wallace, who served as a British Army information officer in Northern Ireland during the early 1970s, claimed that British intelligence had constructed what he called a pseudo-gang within the UVF. Personnel working within the Loyalist organisation who were simultaneously reporting to and receiving direction from British military intelligence and the RUC Special Branch. His claims, and those of Fred Holroyd, were officially dismissed in a 1988 parliamentary debate as unsubstantiated. But that dismissal becomes harder to sustain in the light of what archival research has subsequently confirmed. British intelligence was withholding information about Loyalist bombers. The UDR and UVF membership were documented to overlap at the highest operational levels, and the Garda files that might have corroborated or complicated the picture were systematically unavailable. The political context of May 17, 1974, isn't incidental to this picture. It's the backdrop that makes the picture legible. The Ulster Workers' Council strike began on May 14th, 3 days before the bombings. Its explicit goal was to collapse the Sunningdale Agreement, the deal signed in December 1973 that established power sharing between Unionists and Nationalists in Northern Ireland and created a cross-border Council of Ireland. Loyalist paramilitaries and hardline Unionists viewed Sunningdale as a step toward Irish unity. The UVF and UDA were actively enforcing the strike, blocking roads, intimidating workers, shutting businesses that tried to open, and cutting off fuel supplies. May 17th was day 3. The strike was gaining momentum. The power-sharing executive still stood. The Sunningdale executive collapsed on May 28th, 11 days after the bombings. The strike worked. Whether the Dublin and Monaghan bombings directly accelerated that outcome is a question the available record can't fully resolve. What it can establish is the timing. The worst atrocity of the Troubles was executed during the 3-day window between the start of the Loyalist industrial action that would bring down the only experiment in Irish political power sharing and the moment that experiment actually fell. Multiple secondary historical accounts describe the alleged strategic logic that investigators and historians have associated with the more extreme elements of British intelligence in this period. The Republic of Ireland functioned, in British security terms, as an operational safe haven for the Provisional IRA. British officials pressed Dublin repeatedly for harder action against Republican networks operating from Southern Territory. The theory advanced by some historians is that certain figures within the British security apparatus calculated that a catastrophic Loyalist bombing of the Republic itself would force the Irish government into a hard security posture, one that would compromise its ability to tolerate, or appear to tolerate, Republican activity on its territory. Destabilise the Republic. Force Dublin's hand. Those are secondary source arguments, not primary document findings. But they connect to things that are documented. British intelligence had active concerns about the Republic as an IRA operational base. British intelligence possessed information about cross-border Loyalist operations and chose not to share it. British intelligence had personnel embedded within Loyalist networks who were committing violence with apparent impunity. And all of this was happening simultaneously with a constitutional crisis in Northern Ireland that Loyalist paramilitaries, with their security force allies, were actively trying to exacerbate. The UWC strike was the political crisis. The Dublin and Monaghan bombings were the accompanying strike in a different register. 3 days into the strike that ended power sharing, 33 people were killed in the Republic. The symmetry is uncomfortable, and it has never been explained. In July 1993, 19 years after the attack, Yorkshire Television broadcast a documentary called Hidden Hand, the Forgotten Massacre. It alleged that the bombers had been working as agents for the British Intelligence Corps and the RUC Special Branch. The same month, the UVF issued its public statement claiming sole responsibility. The two events, the television investigation raising the allegation, the UVF issuing its retrospective attribution, occurred within weeks of each other, 19 years after the fact. No one has ever been convicted of the May 17th bombings. Not one person. Not for the Parnell Street bomb, not for Talbot Street, not for South Leinster Street, not for Monaghan. 50 years on, that fact stands unchanged. The Barron inquiry, established in 2003, ran into the same wall at every turn. Justice Barron repeatedly recorded that his work was seriously hampered by lack of cooperation and incomplete disclosure from British authorities, including the security and intelligence services. He was denied access to British military and intelligence files. He couldn't access documents that might have confirmed or denied the specific collusion claims he was investigating. The Irish government had established a serious judicial inquiry. The British government provided the minimum required to avoid total diplomatic rupture, and nothing more. The European Court of Human Rights addressed this directly. In the case of Cummins and others versus United Kingdom, the court found that the UK had failed adequately to investigate aspects of these collusion claims. The ECHR judgment specifically noted that the Barron report had discussed the sourcing of explosives for the Dublin and Monaghan bombings as a key investigative question that remained unresolved, partly because relevant British records had not been made available. An independent international legal body found that Britain had not done enough to investigate its own potential role in 33 civilian deaths. That judgment was delivered in 2006. Nearly 2 decades have since passed. The Oireachtas Joint Committee on Justice, which held hearings based on Barron's findings between 2004 and 2008, concluded there was prima facie evidence of collusion involving members of the security forces. The committee further concluded that the British state had not fully cooperated with efforts to uncover the truth. The Irish Dáil passed unanimous motions demanding British cooperation in 2008 and again in 2011. A Dáil debate on May 14, 2024, recorded formally that the British state refused to release its files on who its agents were and what roles its agents and members played in the attacks. Refused. Not declined, not deferred, not processed under different procedures. Refused. The British government's own account of its cooperation, recorded in a 2005 Hansard debate, characterised its engagement with the Barron inquiry as full and cooperative. The Irish inquiry documentation characterises the same engagement as systematically insufficient. One of those accounts isn't accurate. The missing files aren't only on the British side, and that detail matters. The McEntee Commission, established after the Barron inquiry to continue investigating certain matters it couldn't resolve, produced a finding that deserves far more attention than it has received. The Commission reported that huge amounts of relevant documentation have gone missing from the Garda files, and the fact that it is impossible to determine whether further documentation may also be missing due to massive failures in the Garda document management system of the time. The primary Garda investigation report, dated August 9, 1974, compiled less than 3 months after the worst bombing in the history of the Irish state, was simply not accessible when later investigators went looking for it. The forensic documentation that would normally record explosive composition, timing mechanism design, and detonator specifications for 4 car bombs that killed 33 people. Unavailable. Gone. The McEntee Commission was explicit that its investigation didn't have access to the Garda Síochána investigation report into the Dublin bombings dated 9 August 1974. Based on the files that do exist, the Commission found it impossible to determine with any certainty why the Garda investigation was wound down less than 3 months after the bombings. Justice Barron's earlier inquiry had already concluded the investigation stopped prematurely. But without the records that might explain that decision, the question of who gave the order to wind it down and why can't be answered from the existing archive. The Irish police force responsible for investigating the worst mass murder in the state's modern history closed the case within 90 days. The documentation explaining that decision then disappeared. That isn't a cold case that ran out of leads. It's a case that was shut while leads were still fresh, and whose administrative paper trail subsequently vanished. At the 50th anniversary commemoration on May 17, 2024, the Irish Taoiseach attended a memorial service and called publicly for all government files on the bombings to be released. The Irish Taoiseach was present. The British government didn't release the files. Justice for the Forgotten, formed in 1996 by bereaved families who felt the state had never seriously pressed for answers, represents the overwhelming majority of families who lost people on May 17th. Its membership also includes survivors of the 1972 Dublin bombings and the Miami Showband massacre, communities joined together by the same unresolved question. The group's demands have been consistent since it was established: full disclosure of British intelligence and military files, an inquiry with genuine cross-border investigative powers, and the same institutional scrutiny that has been applied to other Troubles atrocities. Their advocate, Margaret Irwin, described the exclusion of Dublin and Monaghan victims from peace process legacy mechanisms as the great anomaly. The Good Friday Agreement created frameworks for addressing Northern Ireland's conflict victims. The 33 people killed in Dublin and Monaghan were killed in the Republic. They fell outside those frameworks. The worst day of the conflict was structurally excluded from the architecture built to address the conflict's legacy. The Northern Ireland Troubles Legacy and Reconciliation Act 2023 has created further complications for families seeking cross-border accountability. Irwin and other advocates have described it as a huge challenge. The mechanisms designed to process legacy claims in Northern Ireland don't extend to the Republic. The families of 33 Dublin and Monaghan victims navigate a jurisdictional gap that was baked into every peace process negotiation. There is a second layer to this story that functions as its own quiet accusation. The Dublin and Monaghan bombings killed more people than any other single day of the Troubles. They killed more than Omagh, which has a museum, sustained documentary coverage, ongoing civil legal proceedings, and a permanent place in public memory. They killed more than Bloody Sunday. And yet, most people familiar with the broad outline of the Troubles wouldn't immediately name May 17, 1974, as the conflict's worst single day. There are structural reasons for this. The bombings happened in the Republic of Ireland, not Northern Ireland. British media attention was centred on Northern Ireland throughout the conflict. Attacks south of the border received less sustained coverage in the British press, which shaped the international historical framing of events for decades. Don Mullen's 2000 book on the bombings, the first major investigative text on the subject, was described by one academic as an attempt to break the silence surrounding them, meaning silence was still the default condition 26 years after the event. An academic study published in 2023 notes explicitly that while major violent events in Northern Ireland began receiving scrutiny through the Belfast Agreement's legacy mechanisms, the Dublin and Monaghan bombings haven't received equivalent institutional attention. The disparity is measurable. Bloody Sunday prompted a 12-year British public inquiry, the Saville Inquiry, which cost £191 million and ultimately concluded that British paratroopers had committed unjustified killings. Its findings changed the public record of what happened on that day in Derry. The families of the 33 Dublin and Monaghan victims have received a non-judicial private commission, whose inquirer was denied the documents he needed. The comparison isn't a grievance, it's a record of what institutional pressure actually looks like when it's applied, and what happens when it isn't. A conflict's memory is shaped by who controls the narrative, who sustains the investigation, and which governments face political and legal pressure to answer. The worst single day of the Troubles, in terms of civilian casualties, has been processed through the quietest available mechanisms and given the weakest available tools. That outcome has never been random. The most recent major official finding came on December 9, 2025, when a report connected to Operation Canova, the PSNI commissioned review examining the Glenanne gang's activities, concluded there was no evidence UK security forces cooperated with the Ulster Volunteer Force to carry out the 1974 Dublin and Monaghan car bombings. That finding sits in direct tension with Barron's conclusion that British military assistance to the UVF was likely. It also arrived after John Butcher had publicly stated at the 50th anniversary commemoration that there was collusion between elements of the security forces and loyalist paramilitaries in the Glenanne gang's activities overall. There is a precise distinction between those two statements, and it's exactly where the unresolved question lives. Butcher described collusion across the gang's wider operational history. The December 2025 report said it found no evidence of collusion, specifically in the planning or execution of the May 17th attacks. Those are different claims. The gang operated with security force collusion. Whether that collusion extended to directing or enabling the Dublin and Monaghan bombings specifically is what the December 2025 report found no documentable evidence to confirm. No evidence isn't the same as no collusion. It means the surviving record doesn't confirm it. And the surviving record is the product of 50 years of archival management that includes, as the McEntee report documented, catastrophic losses from the Garda files and, as Barron documented, systematic withholding by British authorities. Conclusions drawn from an incomplete record are themselves incomplete. The people most responsible for the record being incomplete are the same people whose potential involvement is in question. Here is the honest summary of what the evidence establishes. The attack was carried out by the UVF, almost certainly by units from its Belfast and Mid-Ulster brigades. The Mid-Ulster Brigade, under Billy Hanna, who simultaneously held a British Army commission as a UDR captain, was deeply embedded in the Glenanne gang network, alongside serving and former members of the RUC and British Army intelligence. Multiple investigators and named witnesses have alleged that Glenanne network personnel participated in planning or executing the May 17th operation. No one has been convicted. The Garda investigation was wound down within 3 months, and key forensic files disappeared. The British government has refused across 5 decades to release intelligence records that might identify who planned the attack and who may have enabled it. Justice Barron found it likely that British military personnel assisted the UVF. The European Court of Human Rights found that the UK failed to adequately investigate its own potential involvement. The Irish Parliament concluded there was prima facie evidence of collusion. British Army and RUC intelligence about Loyalist suspects was withheld from Irish investigators before and after the attack. The December 2025 Canova report found no direct evidence of security force collusion in these specific bombings. That is the most recent official finding, and it matters. But the same report was produced from a record that the Barron Inquiry, the McEntee Commission and the ECHR have all documented as incomplete, partly through loss, partly through deliberate withholding. Drawing a conclusion of no evidence from an incomplete archive answers less than it appears to. None of what is documented constitutes a legal verdict. No court has found the British state guilty of involvement. That is the limit of what the existing record can support. But here is what isn't in dispute. 33 people were killed on May 17, 1974. No one has been prosecuted. The files that might identify who planned the attack and who may have assisted with it have been either lost or withheld. The British government has refused, across 50 years and multiple changes of government, to release the relevant intelligence records. And the families who lost people that Friday are still, in 2024, asking the same questions they started asking in 1996. If there is nothing in those files, releasing them costs nothing. If there is something in them, the British government has been making a choice every year since 1974 about whose justice matters and whose does not. The worst day of the Troubles, 33 dead, no verdicts, no files, no answers. The case is still open. It has always been open. It was just never allowed to be properly investigated. If this is the kind of history you think deserves to be told, subscribe. There's more where this came from.